Welcome back to my channel. Today I am covering a true crime case known as the Clydach Murders. Just to warn you, this case involves the murder of two young children. This case took place in a large village called Clydach, which is just outside Swansea in South Wales. I am going to give you some background on the victims. Amanda Power, better known as Mandy Power, was a 34-year-old nurse from South Wales. At the age of 16 she met the man of her dreams, that would later become her husband, Michael Power. They both married when she was in her early 20s. Michael was a baker and Mandy a nurse, and at this point they weren't really earning enough money to start the rest of their life together, such as buying their own home and starting a family. Shortly after they married, they decided to move in with Mandy's mother Doris Dawson, so that they could save up enough money for a deposit to buy their own home. Mandy's mum Doris was in her 70s at this point. She was really popular and loved by the residents of Clydach, and so, by default, they also loved Mandy because she was her daughter. Mandy and Michael hadn't quite reached their savings goal as yet, but rather unexpectedly Mandy fell pregnant. They had both always wanted to have children, and even though it wasn't planned, they decided that they now needed to get their own home, and start their family earlier than planned. Mandy gave birth to a baby girl, and that they named Katie. All three of them moved into their new home, and shortly after the move, Mandy fell pregnant for the second time. 2 years after Katie was born she gave birth to Emily. Everything seemed to be going well for the family, but after a few years, Michael decided that he did not want this life anymore. It's unknown specifically why they split up, but they got a divorce and they went their separate ways. Michael found a new girlfriend, and started his new life, but he was still very much a part of Katie and Emily's life. He saw them regularly, and contributed to their upbringing, and was a good father. Mandy found herself now living in a home that she could no longer afford on just one wage. Around the same time, Mandy's mum Doris was in her mid-70s, when she suffered from a brain hemorrhage that would leave her dependent and needing constant care. Mandy decided that she was going to downsize to a more affordable home, and would let Doris come to live with her, so that she could care for her. Mandy bought a semi-detached house at 9 Kelvin Road in Clydach, and they all moved in. Mandy was still working as a nurse, and caring for her mum, and she came to the point where she felt she had no life outside of this. She decided that she was ready to start dating again. She met a few men and even started an affair with a local taxi driver, but none of them had swept her off her feet, and she did not see a long-term relationship with any of them. She also knew that she wanted more than just a man. She wanted to have a social life and to make friends, and so she decided to join a local women's rugby team. She had always been interested in sport but had never quite found the time to take part in any. Mandy had arranged a tarot evening and had invited friends from the rugby team. She had noticed a woman that was also on the rugby team, and she had commented to a friend that she found this woman very attractive, but she just assumed that she was straight and would not be interested in Mandy. This woman was named Alison Lewis. Alison had found out about this, and they both started an affair together. Between 1998 and 1999 they started a lesbian affair and became inseparable. They were always seen together. Alison had children and a husband, but Mandy and the girls were always invited to parties, and other get-togethers. Alison would stay over at Mandy's house sometimes, using the excuse that Mandy was going through some issues and she needed support. Alison was a former police officer, but she had had to resign from the force after suffering with mental health issues, and was not in a job at the time she met Mandy. She was trying to get herself back on her feet, and she joined the rugby team for the same reason Mandy did: she wanted friends. All of this came to an abrupt end on June 27, 1999 at 4:27 am when emergency services received the first of several frantic phone calls from the residents on Kelvin Road, informing them that there was a house fire at 9 Kelvin Road. Moments later the fire brigade arrived and started to tackle the blaze. The main blaze was in the kitchen, although there were flames and smoke visible at every window of the house. Neighbors began congregating outside the house as they had been woken up, and wanted to see what was going on. Neighbors had called Mandy's sister, who arrived within minutes around 5 a.m. Neighbors informed the firefighters that they believed that all 4 occupants were still inside the house. Mandy, her mum Doris Dawson, and two girls Katie and Emily. When the fire was out, the first firefighters started climbing the stairs in search of the occupants, whilst the paramedics set up on the grass outside in anticipation of having to work on the occupants. It was still full of smoke, so he felt around with his hands, and that is when he located 10-year-old Katie on the landing. She was unresponsive and he carried her outside to the paramedics. The next body they found was 8-year-old Emily, who was also unresponsive, so they carried her outside. The next body was that of Mandy Power, 34, who was found in the bathroom. She was found naked at the time and also unresponsive. All three victims appeared to be heavily covered in blood, and the paramedics assumed that maybe they had fallen and injured themselves whilst trying to escape. Finally, they located the body of 80-year-old Doris Dawson, who was found in her bedroom. She was still laid in her bed, and because she was already deceased and there was nothing they could do to save her, the firefighters decided to leave her body there until the scene of crime officers and forensics arrived. The paramedics worked on resuscitating the girls for quite a while, but all three were pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedics now attempted to locate where the blood was coming from. Initially, the paramedics were struggling to get oxygen masks over the victims' heads, because there was so much blood, and one of the girls' heads seemed to be disfigured. On further inspection, it appeared all three of them had sustained severe head injuries. They realized that all four of them had been dead for a while before the being found, and that the fire did not appear to be their cause of death. 3 generations of the same family had been wiped out in one blaze. 2 young girls who had the rest of their lives ahead of them, a loving mother, and a doting grandmother. This sent shockwaves through the community, and even people who didn't know the family shared their sorrow at this horrific incident. All 4 of the bodies were taken for an autopsy, and it was quickly confirmed that the cause of the deaths was from bludgeoning. They had all been murdered. They had all been beaten to death, some more severely than others. Based on the injuries, that pathologists theorized that the murder weapon had been a long heavy pole, and that it had been used with so much force that it had smashed all of their skulls in multiple different places. Forensic investigator Claire Galbraith was the first person to specify that she believed that Doris had been killed first, most likely whilst she was still sleeping in bed. Another investigator also specified that it appeared she had been the only one at home when she was murdered. He believed that she was killed first, and then the murderer had waited inside the house for Mandy and the girls to arrive home. The reason it is known Doris was killed first is due to a few key pieces of evidence. As Doris was being murdered, the killer had raised the pole above their head to hit her, and whilst doing so, they had hit the light bulb on the ceiling above them, and blown the electrics in the top floor of the house. If the killer were to attempt to kill another 3 people, they would not have been able to do it in complete darkness, and so they would have to fix the electrics. Once Doris had been murdered, the killer went into Katie and Emily's bedroom, and in there was a television on top of a chair. The killer lifted the television off, and placed it onto the bed. They carried the chair downstairs and went into the bathroom, which is where the fuse box was located. The killer stood on the chair, repaired the fuse and turned the electrics back on. This suggests a few things. 1. The killer had enough time between killing Doris and the other 3 to go and fix the fuse box. 2. The killer knew where the fuse box was, so maybe they had been there previously, and were known to the family. 3. The chair that was taken downstairs didn't have any blood on it, however, the television in Katie and Emily's bedroom did have blood spatters on it. This means that Emily's murder, which had happened in her bedroom, must have happened after the television and chair were moved, otherwise the chair would have blood on it also. Police now believed that because of this evidence, the murders had been premeditated and planned, because the killer had waited inside the home for the other 3 to arrive home. Mandy had been beaten the worst out of all 4 victims, and it was clear the focus of aggression was on her specifically. She had almost 40 injuries all over her body. Her skull had been broken into 10 separate pieces, and it seemed that she had also been strangled at some point during the attack, although it was not with enough force that would have killed her, or rendered her unconscious. She had been beaten in the head so severely, that one of her teeth had come out and was found on the floor. She had obvious self-defense wounds all over her arms and hands. She had obviously fought the attacker. She had also been sexually assaulted, her body was found naked, and there was a sex toy still inside her. It had either been inserted whilst she was unconscious or when she was already dead. Pathologists believed the latter. There were no trauma or injuries to her genitals to suggest that any rape other than with the sex toy had taken place, and there were no traces of semen found. Mandy's body was found with a silver wristwatch on her wrist. Family and friends informed police that they had never seen it before. Neither did they know who it belonged to. Did the watch belong to the killer? Who had put the watch on her? It is still unknown even to this day who this belongs to. From studying blood spatter analysis, the investigators were able to identify that the attack on Mandy had begun in her own bedroom, and had spanned across multiple rooms in the upstairs of the property. She went from her bedroom, into Katie and Emily's bedroom and then into Doris's room. There was a wound on Mandy's head that corresponded with blood found on a set of drawers in Doris's room, and so they believed the attack had ended there. The attack on Mandy had continued even after she had died. Her body was found in the bathroom and appeared to have been washed. Katie and Emily had also been beaten to death, and several pieces of their skulls were found on the floor. Emily had lost several of her teeth, and these were later found on her bedroom floor. It appeared that Katie had been the last victim to die, because the murder weapon was found near to her and with mainly her blood on it. The investigations inside the house took nearly 3 weeks to complete, which was the longest crime scene investigation that Wales had ever seen at the time. Investigators discovered that the fire was actually a combination of 4 fires in different areas of the house, and they appeared to have been lit at different times. They believed that the killer had been watching the house to monitor the progression of the fire, and when they had noticed it was taking too long, they had returned to the house and lit others in order to speed up the process. The first fire was lit in Doris's bedroom. She had newspapers around her body that were set alight by the killer, which is believed to have been started between 2 and 2:30 a.m. There was another fire lit in Mandy's bedroom which was lit around a similar time. A small fire was found in the living room. The fire was a cloth set alight on a small table along with 2 pictures of the girls. The fourth fire, which is the one that caused the most damage, was in the kitchen and was lit around 3:30 to 4 a.m. So there is a gap of around an hour and a half between the first and last. Police located the murder weapon, which was a 1-meter-long metal pole, found on the landing near Katie's body. They believe that it wasn't taken to the house by the killer, and that it was already inside the house. It was much lighter than they had imagined, and the killer would have needed to use a great deal of force to inflict the severity of injuries that they caused. All of the upstairs rooms except for the bathroom had blood spatter all over the walls and ceiling. Although they believe no attack took place in the bathroom, the bath had been half filled with water which had blood in it. There are 2 possibilities. The blood was either from the killer washing blood off themselves before leaving the crime scene, or from washing Mandy's body. One important discovery was a white sports sock that was covered in blood located near Mandy's body. It had the blood of all 4 victims on it, and fibers from it were located on all 4 bodies, in multiple areas of the house. It seemed that the sock had been used as a glove in order to prevent leaving fingerprints or DNA at the scene, which suggests the murder was planned, and that the killer was aware of the need to eliminate forensic evidence. One very important piece of evidence that the police discovered was a broken men's chain necklace found in Doris's bedroom. It was a 20-inch 9-carat gold chain that was covered in blood, and had a broken clasp on it. This was the only piece of evidence police had to identify a potential killer or a suspect. On the day of the fire, police started talking to neighbors and friends to identify possible links to the family, and to try and identify possible suspects. They spoke to one of the neighbors who lived opposite, Rob Wachowski, who was the first person to call the emergency services. He told them that he was woken by his son at around 4:30 a.m. and heard noises outside, which he thought was someone possibly trying to break into a house or a car, and so he looked out of his window, which is when he could see flames and smoke coming from 9 Kelvin Road. He grabbed his mobile and started to call Mandy's mobile phone, and then her landline to wake her up, or to check if she was even at home, but there was no answer. He ran over to the house and started banging on the door, hoping to wake Mandy so they could get out, but there was no answer. He went around to the back of the house, and he could see that the fire was really ablaze, and shortly after another neighbor came to help him. They managed to break down the back door, but they were hit with so much smoke and heat that it was not safe for them to enter. Moments later, the fire brigade arrived. Mandy Power's ex-husband Michael Power was informed of the deaths later that morning, and he completely broke down. He was unable to speak about the murders for 2 months. In murder cases, the police automatically look at ex-partners as having a possible motive. He was questioned, but was quickly ruled out as he had no motive, and he had a solid alibi. He had been at home with his girlfriend. He was also unable to give the police the names of any possible suspects. As they had no suspects to go on, the police began drawing up a list of suspects based only on their association to the family. In the weeks following the tragedy, the outside of 9 Kelvin Road became covered in flowers, tributes, stuffed animals for the girls. They were being left by people who didn't even know the victims, but were so affected by it. On the day of the funerals, the streets were lined with thousands of mourners who turned out in support of the victims and their family. Police started looking at the men that she had been having dates with, possibly because they were married, and may have killed them to prevent their wives from finding out. It could also be possible that one of the wives had taken revenge on Mandy. A year and a half had passed, and the police were no further on with the case, and there were no new developments. They were relying on continued appeals in newspapers and television, and then started focusing on the gold chain. It was even shown on Crime Watch and in all the newspapers, hoping that someone would recognize it and give them a name, but nobody came forward for quite some time. A number of months later, a man called the police incident room and told them he thought the chain belonged to his cousin David Morris, sometimes known as Di Morris. The man said that he had spoken with his cousin recently, who had expressed that he was anxious about being caught up in the investigation, because the chain belonged to him. He said he had been having an affair with Mandy Power at the time of her murder, and had left the chain at her house the last time he visited her, which was actually the day of her murder. The police immediately arrested him and took him to the police station for questioning. He initially denied that it was his chain, but later, he changed his story and admitted that it was his. Police checked his name on the database and discovered that he had an extensive criminal history, dating back to when he was 14 years old. Many of these convictions and charges for quite violent offenses, such as street fights, drugs, robbery, assault, and multiple driving offenses. He had also served 5 years in prison for a house robbery. He also had a reputation in the area as a violent and aggressive man. At the time David Morris was 38 years old, he was a scrap metal dealer, and was father to 3 girls. He was a good father to them, although he hadn't been as good to his ex-partners. David Morris had been married once in the past, but was now divorced. His wife had left him after being in a relationship full of domestic violence and abuse. At the time of his arrest, he had a new girlfriend known as Mandy Jewell. This relationship seemed to be taking a similar path. Neighbors had witnessed him verbally abusing her in the street on many occasions, and had actually witnessed him hitting her with a shovel in the garden. They tried to help her, but he then turned his aggression on them. On the night of the murders, Saturday, June 26, 1999, David Morris had been at the New Inn pub on the outskirts of Clydach, where he was drinking and taking amphetamines with his girlfriend Mandy Jewell, and some friends. He and Mandy started arguing again, and she then left the pub, leaving him there with his friends. Witnesses say that he was becoming angrier and angrier as the night went on, and a while later at around 11 p.m. he told his friends that he was leaving, and that he was going to go to Mandy Power's house to have sex with her. Witnesses say he left at 11:30 p.m. Police believe that when David Morris left the pub he began the walk to Mandy Power's house, which was around half a mile, and would take him around 15 minutes. He would have arrived at Mandy Power's house a few minutes before Mandy and the girls were dropped off by a taxi, at 11:48 p.m. They say he demanded sex with Mandy, and when she refused he went into a fit of rage, pushing his way into the house, and then killing all 4 of them, before setting the house on fire. They also believed that when he was attacking Mandy, she had reached up towards his neck to fend him off, and had grabbed hold of his necklace and ripped it off, which is why it was found covered in blood. There were no witnesses that could place David Morris on the road to Mandy's house that night, but the police believe he knew a quieter route where he would not have been seen by anyone. David Morris gave police an alibi, but it could not be confirmed. He changed his story twice and it did not match what his girlfriend Mandy Jewell told police. David Morris told police that he had left the pub at 11:30 p.m. and walked to the flat he shared with his girlfriend Mandy Jewell, which would have taken around 15 minutes. But after arguing with her earlier that night, he decided not to go inside, and instead he decided to walk to his mother's house, which was a few miles away. He said that he had walked for around an hour and a half, but when it started raining, and knowing that he still had several miles to walk, he said he turned around, and started walking back to his flat. He said that he arrived home at around 3 a.m. and that Mandy Jewell had answered the door to him. He put his wet clothes in the washing machine and then went to bed. Mandy Jewell's version differed, because she had originally told police that he arrived home between 10:30 and 11 p.m., and that she didn't see him when he entered the flat. In court she changed this and said she did not know what time he had arrived home, but she did get up to let him in. It is not known why she decided to change her story at the last minute. If David Morris had left the pub at 11:30 p.m. as witnesses state, this would mean he would have arrived at Mandy's house just 3 minutes before she was dropped off by the taxi at 11:48 p.m. This would not have given him time to enter the house, kill Doris Dawson, fix the electrics, and then to wait for Mandy and the girls to arrive home, before killing them. This timescale was dismissed by the prosecution. When David Morris was interviewed by police on the first occasion, he didn't tell them that he had been in a relationship with Mandy. They knew that they were friends, and so they asked him which rooms he had been into inside Mandy's house. He told them he had only been downstairs. In a separate interview, he admitted that he had been in a sexual relationship with Mandy, and that he had been upstairs with her. When asked why he lied to police, he said that he did not want his current girlfriend to find out he had been cheating on her. Another piece of evidence against David Morris came from a police officer. The officer says that he had been in a room at the police station whilst David Morris was in a discussion with his solicitor. He says that he had been checking the recording equipment, and had accidentally heard David Morris tell his solicitor that he had slept with Mandy Power, and that he had arrived home at 4 a.m. David Morris was asked about the gold chain found at the scene and he repeatedly denied that it was his in interviews. The clasp was broken on the chain and it looked as if the owner had used a piece of wire to hold it together. Photos of David Morris were analyzed and the police noticed that when he was wearing the chain, they could see it was held together by what appeared to be copper wire. There were no pieces of wire found at the crime scene, however. The chain also had flecks of white paint on it, and when this was analyzed, it appeared to match the paint in David Morris's kitchen. David Morris continued to deny that it was his until a few weeks before his trial began. He again gave the reason for not admitting it was his, to be that he did not want his girlfriend finding out that he was having an affair with Mandy. So, in part 2 of this video I shall be giving you details of the other suspects in the case, and also the outcome of the case. Please remember to give a thumbs up on this video. Please leave your comments about the case in the comments section. Also, hit the subscribe button so that YouTube will notify you when I upload part 2. Thanks for watching.